The Babylonian Talmud confirms Jesus' crucifixion on the eve of Passover and the accusations against Christ of practicing sorcery and encouraging Jewish apostasy.
The Talmud says what? It most certainly was not talking about the Jesus that supposedly started Christianity. In fact, that reference is a completely different Jesus, and none of the information about that Jesus matches up with the Jesus that supposedly started Christianity. You know, I didn't really expect better evidence from Questions Ministries, but if you heathens want to fuck around and find out what Question Ministries thinks proves the historical Jesus, then please stay tuned. What's up, heathens? How y'all doing? I'm the Godless Engineer, and I analyze apologist claims to give you the best arguments and information so that you can stand up and use your voice. Today, we're going to be taking a look at Questions Ministries and their attempts to prove that Jesus existed in history. Typically, I would want to pick either just a general Christian that is using apologists or scholars to prove a historical Jesus and see, the effect that these scholars and apologists have on the general public. But I also like to look at these professional apologetics ministries because they are relying primarily on the New Testament scholars that everybody wants me to cover. And it's not that I don't cover those scholars or people with actual degrees in them. It's just that oftentimes those videos require a bit more research and a bit more time to record. I'm currently writing up responses to the rest of Dr. Craig Evans' appearance on that one video, and so that'll be coming soon. But in the meantime, I wanted to kind of address like a really quick firing off of evidence for Jesus to show people that the evidence really isn't all that great. Today we're going to hear about non-Christian sources, although there's going to be some light bitching at the very beginning, but aside from that, they primarily just use non-Christian sources, and we'll cover all of this here in a minute. But I do want to encourage people to go to your respective app store and get the Crestus app, where if you want more detailed information about everything I'm going to be talking about today, that is where you're going to find it if you don't want to spend the money to buy the dozens of books it would take in order to cover all of, the information that we're going to cover here. Crestus is your best bet for getting this kind of information. So definitely consider going and checking out Crestus today. All right, so let's get on into the video.
Did Jesus really exist? Is there any historical evidence of Jesus Christ?
So glad you asked right at the beginning. So for the first question, probably not. Most likely, he's just a created figure that was made specifically to give Judaism its Messiah that had been foretold for hundreds of years in the Old Testament. They knew one was coming, and so they expected one, and when one didn't come, they just created him out of the existing scriptures that they had. And to answer your second question, no, there is no good evidence to point to his existence. There's vague and ambiguous evidence that we'll get into here in a minute, but as far as good evidence that definitely proves he existed in history, there's not any of that at all.
We're going to answer those questions. Typically, when this question is asked, the person asking qualifies this question with outside the Bible. We do not grant this idea that the Bible cannot be considered a source of evidence for the existence of Jesus. The vast majority of scholars, both Christian and non-Christian, will grant that the epistles of Paul were in fact written less than 40 years after Jesus' death. In terms of ancient manuscript evidence, this is extraordinarily strong proof.
So, I have to say, starting off this video with something I can agree with is great. I love that I can agree with this video on this particular point because now the Gospels not historical. They are not history, even though a lot of people want to use them as history and proclaim them to be history, even going as far as to say that most scholars agree that they're historical accounts of Jesus. That's just simply not true, and the evidence is overwhelming for that. I've actually got got a clip on my GE Shorts channel, if you want to go and check that out, where I break down why Luke is definitely not history. And since, all of the Gospels are based off of earlier works and earlier Gospels and all this other stuff, it essentially lays out why we don't consider them to be historical accounts. And they never attempted to be. So go on over there and check that out if you want to know more about why they're not history. But safe to say, the Gospels are not history. Now, I do agree that Paul is the best evidence that the Christians have that points towards maybe Jesus was a real historical figure. I say that because we know that at least a person referenced to as Paul existed, and he wrote a number of these epistles. That is the earliest account of Jesus that would not be tainted by the gospel information. That's why Paul is so important. Paul, writing in the 50s, and then on into the 60s, predates the Gospels. So there's no way that Paul could get his information from the Gospels, despite what fundamentalist apologists want you to think. So, what is the best evidence for historical Jesus? It would have to be Paul. But like I said, even Paul doesn't get you to a historical Jesus. I have my reasons for that. Again, I got a lot of this information on the GE Shorts channel, or go and check out Crestus.
It's also important to recognize that in AD 70, the Romans invaded and destroyed most of Israel, slaughtering its inhabitants. Despite this and the geographical limitation of his ministry, a surprising amount of information about Jesus can be drawn from secular historical sources.
But all of these sources, I don't mean to taint what they're about to say, but I've analyzed these sources, and we'll go a bit deeper into why they're not independent of the Gospels. But all of the secular sources come way after the Gospels were being written. Once you hit 70 AD, everything else is tainted, because the 70 AD has the Gospel of Mark being written, and that historicizes Jesus. So everybody after that point is going to believe that Jesus walked and talked on earth and, did all those things. So these secular sources that he's going to be bringing up, you can tell that they were in some way, either directly or indirectly, informed by the Gospels. And I'll be sure to highlight that as we progress through these secular sources.
Tacitus, who is considered one of the more accurate historians of the ancient world, mentioned superstitious Christians who suffered under Pontius Pilate.
Well, there's a slight caveat you have to put with Tacitus here, because while Tacitus is generally considered to be a good historian, that does not mean that what he says about Jesus in his works was not informed by the Gospels in some kind of fashion. And in fact, Robert Van Voorst, a Christian scholar, a New Testament scholar, he agrees with me on this. Just to emphasize how not even New Testament Christian scholars, who I would normally consider to be very biased, don't even use Tacitus to prove that Jesus existed in history, or at least they shouldn't. Here's Robert Van Voorst's opinion on the evidence of Tacitus. Does this testimonium tacitium therefore provide definitive evidence of the existence of Jesus? If we could be certain that Tacitus's account was based on non-Christian sources, the answer would be yes. But as we have seen, such independent knowledge is unverifiable. As R.T. France concludes, while the evidence from Tacitus corroborates the New Testament accounts of the death of Jesus, by itself it cannot prove that events happened as Tacitus had been informed, or even the existence of Jesus. This latter, France correctly argues, has abundant persuasive evidence in the New Testament. Tacitus, careful historian that he was, presumed the existence of Jesus and had no reason to doubt it. So, as you can tell, Robert Van Voorst, New Testament scholar, somebody that I disagree with heavily in his book, Jesus Outside the New Testament, agrees that this information from Tacitus is not independent of the New Testament Gospels. So, declaring him to be this sort of independent account, which is what this video is insinuating here, is just dishonest. Because Tacitus, wherever he got his information from, would have been information from the Gospels, because Tacitus was writing in the 2nd century, and he was pen pals with Pliny the Younger. Pliny the Younger could have informed him about these beliefs of the Christians, and he could have written that down in his document. The important point here is that he's in the 2nd century, and he's informed by the current community of Christians, that exist, which include the Gospels. And at the point in time when Tacitus was writing, there probably would have been access to at least 3 of the Gospels that were floating around the Christian community. I'm not saying, and just to explicitly stress this, I'm not saying that Tacitus used the Gospels to inform himself on this. I'm saying that the Christian community at large, either directly or indirectly, informed Tacitus. And that makes Tacitus not independent. And that's if you don't even want to go through the rigmarole of doubting whether or not Tacitus wrote this portion, which there is a very solid argument to say that he didn't even write that. For one thing, where it's mentioned with this Christus or Christus, it was actually originally Crestus, and he called them the Christians. A lot of people want to say that this is a common misspelling that was purposefully done to denigrate this group of people. I haven't really found any good evidence for this. Misspellings often did happen, but in more vulgar works. Not that these works were like cursing all the time, but just in a simpler writing style or a simpler understanding of writing in general. But to say that Tacitus was, writing vulgar stuff instead of being this, very exquisite historian that they all claim he was is a bit of cherry picking, because you can't say that he's the best historian, but he also wrote like shit. I feel like if you're the best historian, then you're going to communicate in the best way that you can or that exists at that time. So don't fall for the cherry picking thing about that. You can also take out the portion of Tacitus that talks about when he was crucified and all this other stuff. You can take that out and the rest of the passage flows seamlessly, which isn't proof that it wasn't there, but it's definitely an indication of a possible interpolation. And coupled with the fact that all of this information is found in the Gospels, it would be very easy for somebody to insert this into Tacitus's work. Let's not even mind that argument because we don't need it. Tacitus was not an independent account of Jesus. He was definitely informed by the New Testament information. That literally means that you can't add it to your list of secular sources for Jesus.
Suetonius, chief secretary to Emperor Hadrian, wrote that there was a man named Christus who lived during the 1st century.
Well, specifically that this Christus person riled up the Jews and caused a lot of disturbances. And it was specifically Christus. And you notice how he speculatively wrote in there Christ. Now, Christ was a title, not a name. Christus is a name, not a title. So it's more likely they were talking about a separate individual called Christus, who Tacitus later tried to suggest that Nero blamed these Christians for the fire in Rome. That seems way more likely than them just misspelling it, because you're requiring these people that were typically regarded as some of the best historians at that time. You're trying to tell me that they wrote like shit, and for some reason around the name Christ or Jesus Christ, they instead decided to misspell his name for some reason without any kind of indication that they were trying to denigrate them or anything like that. It just seems very speculative and arbitrary to me. So Suetonius writing about it happening in 55 and meaning that this Christus person was the one that was causing the problems means that it could not be Jesus Christ, because this all happened in 55. So this literally cannot be a reference to the Jesus that supposedly started Christianity. Paul would have already been an apostle by this time and would have already started writing his stuff about Jesus dying and resurrecting. So it literally makes no sense to bring up Suetonius right here.
Flaviusjosephus, the most famous Jewish historian, refers to James, the brother of Jesus, who was called Christ.
Now, I do have to commend them for not bringing up the Testimonium Flavianum, because that's generally the one thing that a lot of people bring up. They went for the James reference, which is the lesser referenced citation of Jesus in Flavius's work. But the problem with using that is that it was most likely interpolated, because in that passage later on, they reference a completely different Jesus, Jesus ben Damnius, as if they had been talking about that guy the entire time. So it makes more sense that the earlier part, the who was called Christ, was inserted in order to create a reference to Jesus. And the reason why this is the most likely conclusion about this particular reference is that Josephus doesn't bother to explain what a Christ is at that point. Now, if the Testimonium Flavianum had existed in Josephus's work, like a lot of people want to say, then at that point, Josephus, like he's done for several other groups and several other people gospel and the rest of his work would have referenced back to that particular passage to explain what a Christ was to his audience, or to remind them, rather, what a Christ was. But he doesn't do that. So you can't use that particular explanation. The other thing is that Josephus does not explain what a Christ is within that particular paragraph. If this concept of a Christ and what it means to the Jews had not been discussed previously, then Josephus would feel compelled to explain it at that point. But he doesn't do that. And the fact that he doesn't do that is quite odd for Josephus because, like I said before, he does this for every other group that he brings up and mentions to his audience. So it just simply doesn't make sense that this who would be called Christ would be put there. It most likely originally said something about this James being the brother of Jesus ben Damnius. I don't know what form that would have taken, but it would make a lot more sense if Jesus ben Damnius was being referenced and not Jesus who was called Christ. If you want to know why the Testimonium Flavianum was never in Josephus's work, then again, I have a clip on my Shorts channel.
Julius Africanus quotes the historian Phallus in a discussion of the darkness which followed the crucifixion of Christ.
So there's multiple problems with the Phallus evidence. For one thing, this is like third-hand information. So this reference is quoted by George Sincillus, who is quoting Julius Africanus, who is then quoting Phallus. And Phallus was writing in the 2nd century. This doesn't necessarily rule it out as historical evidence, but the other information surrounding this particular section would definitely rule it out as historical evidence. So for one thing, Phallus never centers this event as happening around Judea or anywhere near Jesus was crucified. Also, another thing that makes it problematic is that the eclipse that supposedly happened during Jesus' death or right after Jesus died only occurs in the Gospels. And so that kind of lends us in the direction that it was informed by the Gospels as far as when Phallus was talking about it. But considering that Phallus never attached this event to Jesus' death or even the place where Jesus was crucified, kind of makes it sound like people are just pulling random observations of eclipses out and saying, oh, see, that proves there was an eclipse at Jesus' death. All of this was written at a time after the Gospels had been written and therefore are informed by the Gospels. And how we can know that there was nothing really special about Jesus' death, like, for example, an earthquake or this eclipse that supposedly happened, is that Paul doesn't mention any of these things happening at Jesus' death. I mean, these are very symbolic things with the earthquake and the sky darkening and all this other stuff. That would definitely be referenced by Paul, but because it's not, it's more than likely legendary accretion rather than something that historically happened. So another piece of evidence that doesn't actually independently attest to a historical Jesus. Are you starting to notice a pattern here with all of these pieces of evidence for Jesus? All of them need the Gospels to exist in order for Jesus to exist.
Pliny the Younger recorded early Christian worship practices, including worshiping Jesus as God, noting they were very ethical, and he includes a reference to the love feast and the Lord's Supper.
So yes, Pliny does make a reference to this, but considering that Pliny was writing in the 2nd century, and Pliny was also saying that he was interrogating the Christians, and that he had never heard of the Christians whatsoever before this point. So let me just set the scene. Pliny is interrogating these people, and these people are telling him about their religion in the 2nd century. By the 2nd century, they had 3, if not all 4 Gospels available to them. Jesus was completely historicized by that point, and everybody thought that Jesus actually died on earth and resurrected as a God-man. At that point, you can't use any of the information. That makes Pliny the Younger useless in our investigation of the historical Jesus, because all he does is say, oh, hey, these are Christians. This is what they believe in the 2nd century, and here's how they worship. That's it. This is not an independent reference to Jesus. Why would anybody include this piece of evidence? I have no fucking clue.
The Babylonian Talmud confirms Jesus' crucifixion on the eve of Passover and the accusations against Christ of practicing sorcery and encouraging Jewish apostasy.
All right, so this is where we started out at. I'm glad that we were able to circle back around to this shit, because the Talmud is by far the most deviously used piece of evidence for Jesus. The reason why I say this is because this particular reference to a Jesus of Nazareth being executed and everything actually comes from the reign of King Jannaeus, which happened between 104 BCE and 74 BCE. Also, all of the information surrounding this Jesus' death does not match up whatsoever to the Jesus that supposedly started Christianity. For one thing, he was put to death for sorcery, not blasphemy. You see, they didn't really care about Jesus doing miracles. They cared about the fact that Jesus was talking about how, he is the I am, he's like the Son of God and all this other stuff. That's what they cared about. They didn't care about him doing miracles and shit. Another thing is that this particular Jesus was executed directly by the Jews, not the Romans. He was also stoned, as indicated by Jewish law, and not crucified. And to pile it on, he was executed in Lydda and not Jerusalem. This reference in the Talmud continues on to say that this Jesus had a connection with the government and had 5 disciples that were immediately put to death after him. All of this is contrary to everything we know from either the Gospels or from Paul. So this particular Jesus should not be mentioned. This doesn't prove your point. You need to throw it out. So far in this video, we have not found one single real piece of evidence because you started out the video throwing out the only real evidence that you got, and that's Paul.
Lucian of Samosata was a 2nd century Greek writer who admits that Jesus was worshipped by Christians, introduced new teachings, and was crucified for them. He said that Jesus' teachings included the brotherhood of believers, the importance of conversion, and the importance of denying other gods.
Lucian of Samosata was a satirist that was writing in the 2nd century. Again, as we've already established, everything after the Gospels had been established in the Christian community that would have happened at least by 80 CE. So with Lucian writing in the 2nd century, he was just reporting what the current Christians of that time were saying. So this is not an independent source about Jesus or anything like that. He definitely got his information from a Christian source in some kind of way. Even Robert Van Voorst in his book, Jesus Outside the New Testament, agrees that this information that Lucian was getting was common knowledge at that time. This is not anything that can be used to prove that Jesus existed. It just proves what Christians believed in around 165 CE.
Marbar Serpion confirms that Jesus was thought to be a wise and virtuous man, was considered by many to be the king of Israel, and was put to death by the Jews and lived on in the teachings of his followers.
Marbar Serpion is again, like Lucian of Samosata, unusable to us because he was tainted by gospel information. Scholars have dated this text to between 73 CE and the 3rd century, with the most likely dating being the 2nd century. This is due to the socio-political environment that he's talking about at that time and that he existed within. It fits more with the 2nd century dating than any other dating. And there's multiple reasons to think that he is sourcing his information from either the Gospels themselves or by just talking to Christians or knowing about what Christians believe. For one thing, he links the destruction of the temple to this death of the wise king. That is clearly only taught in the Gospels. Another thing that gives us this indication is that he blames the Jews for this wrongful death. You wouldn't necessarily do that if you were talking about some kind of independent source or anything like that for Jesus, because the outside view would be that the Romans put him to death, not the Jews. The only place where that ever crops up is in the Gospels. Paul never mentions that it's the Jews that killed Jesus. In fact, Paul doesn't even talk about the Romans killing Jesus. Paul specifically talks about the archons of this aeon putting Jesus to death, which some have said means the Romans, but I don't buy that because in other places, Paul uses the same type of phrase to refer to Satan and his demons. So it kind of makes it sound like he was probably most likely talking about Satan and his demons are the ones that crucified Jesus. But I digress. This just simply was not evidence of Jesus.
Then we have the Gnostic writings that all mention Jesus.
I really don't care about the Gnostic writings that mention Jesus. All of these writings occurred way after Christianity was already established. None of these writings occurred like congruently with Paul, reference some kind of independent source for Jesus. These are all things that occurred after that fact.
In fact, we can almost reconstruct the gospel just from early non-Christian sources. Jesus was called the Christ, did magic, led Israel into new teachings, and was hanged on Passover for them in Judea, but claimed to be God and would return, which his followers believed, worshiping him as God.
Yes, and does this not give you some kind of pause when you point this out? Obviously it doesn't, but for anybody that's skeptical and looking at this, if everything that these sources are telling us confirm what is in the Gospels, it kind of seems like maybe the Gospels are the source for all this information. And as we have seen throughout this video, that's most likely where they got this information. So none of this is actual historical proof of Jesus, because what we would need for historical proof of Jesus existing is independent testimony about Jesus walking around and doing stuff on earth. But that's the problem, is that Jesus was historicized so early in Christian history that it's really hard to find good evidence for him being a real person. That leaves us pretty much only with Paul until we can find better evidence. Textual critic Bart Ehrman has just created sources that are behind the Gospels, and then he just summarily labels them as being independent testimony about Jesus, and that all four Gospels have these imaginary sources underneath them, and apparently he can analyze those to know that they're independent accounts. It just seems ridiculous to me if you have to create sources to verify your own position. I'm just working with the information that we have. Given the current documentation about Jesus, there is nothing that solidly places him in history, and that's why I remain a mythicist, and why videos like this and other apologetics videos are starting to bore me, because it's like they're not even considering the critical scholarship on these sources that they're talking about. They're just listing off the same sources that apologists like the dipshit detective use, or like the really bad reporter uses, or Frank Turk with his from the zoo to the goo to you, or goo to the zoo to you, the whole thing of denying evolution and shit. That is the ultimate place where all of these people are getting this information, and it's just redundant. They don't prove, the sources don't prove that Jesus existed. I think that we need to shift the conversation to primarily talking about Paul and his evidence, because that is the earliest evidence that we have. It also predates the gospel, so it cannot be tainted by the Gospels. If you think that you can make a coherent argument for Jesus's existence using Paul's work, make a video, tag me in it, send it to me. I would love to hear what your argument is, because I'm always looking for good evidence that Jesus existed. Because it's not that I want to be a mythicist or that mythicism is somehow a core part of my atheism. I just want to know what the truth of reality is in this respect. And the fact that apologist organizations like this just cannot even do a bare minimum of looking at the critical scholarship on their sources from their own camp just screams volumes at me.
There is overwhelming evidence for the existence of Jesus Christ, both in secular and biblical history. Perhaps the greatest evidence that Jesus did exist is the fact that literally thousands of Christians in the 1st century AD, including the 12 apostles, were willing to give their lives as martyrs for Jesus Christ. People will die for what they believe to be true, but no one will die for what they know to be a lie.
I particularly hate this argument because the people that were dying as martyrs were separated by whole generations from the people that would have, quote unquote, lied about it. The first Jewish Christians, who are the Jewish Christians that came even before Paul, I don't think that they were lying about it. I think they sincerely believed that all of this had happened. So it's not just a lie or it really happened. That's a false dichotomy. But to present the people that were dying as martyrs as being the ones that concocted a lie is just dishonest. And it doesn't match up with the information that we have. This is just another way that apologists try to use this kind of emotional manipulation about believing something to be true and then lying about it. They're conflating two groups of people that did not live at the same time.
That answers the question, did Jesus really exist? Research.
Do you really think that it did? Nothing that was presented here was really evidence for Jesus. All of it was informed by the Gospels. So you really didn't give a good response to this question other than, hey, here's a bunch of bad information. Of course Jesus existed. It's just tiresome. And then at the end with the nobody would die for a lie argument, I mean, that's tired and played out. So in this video, you really didn't have anything of substance, really. You just rattled off a whole bunch of bad references that have already been debunked by your own side. Anyways, heathens, that's going to be it for me today. I don't know. Do you think that Jesus existed? I'd really love to know what your thoughts are down below, because this is one of the passions that I have on this channel, is really delving into this question and asking this question to people that might be able to give me good answers. And everything that I've found is just either arbitrary, speculative, or not evidence. So let me know what you guys think down below in the comments about either this video or the question, did Jesus exist in general? Let me know down there. While you're down there, why don't you smash that like button and subscribe if you like this kind of video. Don't forget to stand up and use your voice. Bye, heathens.